Good morning, class, and welcome to Week 6, Chapter 5 of Logic and Critical Thinking. This week we'll be discussing deductive logic, and this first section is entitled Reasoning with Necessity. Now, really briefly, what that means is logical necessity. So when we think of necessity, we think of logical necessity. It must follow. It must be the case. And we're not thinking about anything empirical when we speak of necessity. For example, if we don't have oxygen, then we'll necessarily die from not being able to breathe, or the same thing with food, right? We're not talking about empirical necessity or something that relates to cause and effect. We're just thinking of logical necessity, and particularly the structure of arguments. What this means for reasoning is that if we are certain that the premises are true and that the logic is valid, the logical moves from the premises. If the premises are true and the logic is valid, deductively valid, then we are sure that the conclusion is true, meaning the conclusion necessarily must be true, even if it seems counterintuitive that the conclusion is true. If the premises are sound or true and the logic is valid, then the conclusion must be true. And that's what necessity means. So we're going to be reasoning with necessity. This chapter, we will go through the argument of a court justice who is making an argument against the death penalty. So this person is making a deductive argument against the death penalty, and that'll be the first reading. And this chapter is somewhat short in that they don't give us too many readings. This will just be, I believe this is the only reading they will have. So definitely do this, and let's skip to that right now. And there are two study questions related to this. The justice that is arguing is Justice Marshall. And let's look at the study questions. Choose one of these and then choose one exercise question. Again, I know last week I asked for a specific exercise question, but this you get the freedom to choose whichever one you'd like. For the study questions, you may disagree with Marshall's argument. If so, construct a deductive argument of your own to support your conclusion. If you agree with it, what do you find compelling about it? Right, so the deductive reasoning that he does is not really arguable in the sense that he does make a valid argument, but are his premises sound? Might be another way of looking at it. And if you disagree, make your own valid argument. What do you think is the most questionable on Marshall's argument? Why do you think the majority of justices did not agree with him? So although his premises seem to be warranted and his logic is valid, the majority of justices did not agree with him. So if you choose that question, try to make sense as to why that is the case. And let's go over his argument. And this kind of summarizes it here. So premise one, and we've been practicing putting arguments into these types of premises, so this should be pretty familiar. If the death penalty is not excessive, not cruel and unusual, then it must result in either deterrence, i.e., must make it less likely that others will commit the crime punished by death, or it must serve the purpose of retribution, i.e., must satisfy society's demand that the offender get punished the punishment they deserve. So that's premise one. Premise two, the evidence viewed in Furman is convincing that the death penalty is not necessary as a deterrent to crime in our society. And when you are reading this, look back to these paragraphs. Premise three, there is no constitutionally legitimate legitimate, valid form of retribution that requires the death penalty from paragraphs 3 to 6. Conclusion. Since the death penalty is unnecessary to promote the goal of deterrence or to further any legitimate notion of retribution, the death penalty is an excessive penalty, logically warranted by the combination of the three of premises 1 through 3. So this is essentially the assessment of his argument. After you read the argument that he makes in the pages before this, prior to this, assess it, pull out the argument from the paragraphs, and then see if you agree or disagree. And you can do that by answering questions 1 or 2. Then some of the exercise questions, we won't go over all of them. Choose the one exercise question that you want to answer. So for question 1, who in your opinion is the greatest musical artist of all time? Write a deductive argument to support your claim in which the premise logically implies the conclusion. Now this can be a rather simple question or a rather more complex question, and I'd rather you try to answer it in a more complex way. And here's what I mean. You could make it really easy. So for example, you could write a premise that says something like, the greatest musical artist of all time is the one that sold the most records of all time. And then you'd sort of fill in the blank. Blank musician or artist sold the most records of all time, therefore they're the greatest. And that's a perfectly valid argument, right? But the question remains is that another person might not agree with your premise, right? So instead of saying most record sales, they might say, oh, most creativity, or has the greatest fan base, or produces the most records across different musical genres, or influenced other musicians, or and you could just continue. So it might be more complex to try to prove your premise. You can use a deductively valid argument really quickly. You just says if then this, therefore that. That's not terribly complex, but do practice that. But I would try to go one step further if you answer question 1 and try to justify your premise. Not just justify your conclusion, but why do you think that this premise, as opposed to another premise, is the best for assessing the greatest musical artist of all time? Much like last chapter, I will post a PowerPoint after this chapter that kind of assesses and goes through all the different questions on the homework. So I'll give you a chance to answer it, then I'll read through the homeworks, and then I will post a follow-up PowerPoint reviewing it, all the answers, like with last time. Okay, this is just a brief introductory video. I hope this helps. I look forward to reading all of your answers.